When the temperature dips to -40 degrees, survival requires more than just strength, it demands ingenuity. One mountain man's hidden snow tunnel became the key to keeping his cabin warm against the cruelest winter. But the story behind this clever survival tactic begins with a tragedy that forced him to rethink everything about life in the wilderness. Before we dive into the heart of this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if tales of survival and resilience in the harshest conditions move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will reveal another astonishing frontier secret. The wind howled through the towering pines, sending snow spiraling through the air as if the mountains themselves were in rebellion. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the hearth was a fragile thing, just a flickering glow in the relentless cold. To anyone who had spent even one winter in the Rockies, it would be clear that this was no ordinary storm. The cold had a weight to it, an icy pressure that seemed to press against the very walls of the cabin. For Samuel Hawkins, this winter was shaping up to be the hardest one he had ever faced. It wasn't that he hadn't endured extreme winters before. Samuel had spent the last decade carving out a life in the highlands, far from the nearest town. His cabin, though simple, had kept him safe from the elements and the wild things that roamed these frozen woods. But this storm, this was different. He had come to rely on the shelter of his cabin, its thick log walls, the warm fire that crackled in the stone hearth, but it was no match for the temperatures now plunging past anything he had experienced. Samuel stood near the window, the glass frosted over in delicate patterns of ice. He could see nothing but the swirling storm outside, the world reduced to a blurry swirl of white. There was no way to go out, no way to gather wood, no way to hunt. He had enough supplies to last a few weeks, but the cold could wear down a man faster than hunger. He knew it all too well. He had seen others die from the frost long before the wolves or bears had even gotten close. The cold seeped through the cracks in the cabin, no matter how much he tried to seal them. It was a steady, gnawing presence. The fire in the hearth sputtered, its flames flickering weakly as if protesting the impossible chill. Samuel's breath clouded the air, even within the safety of his cabin. He wrapped his thick fur coat tighter around himself, pulling his woolen scarf up to cover his nose and mouth. It wasn't enough. That night, as the wind picked up its furious howling outside, Samuel lay awake, his mind working furiously. He had built this cabin with his own hands. He had always been proud of it, but now he saw its flaws. The insulation was not enough. The gaps between the logs, though small, allowed the cold to creep in like an invisible enemy. No amount of firewood or thick blankets would stop it. The only way to survive this kind of cold was to rethink everything. It was in the darkest hours of that bitter night, while listening to the relentless storm rage on, that the idea came to him, an idea that would save his life and change the way men built shelters in these wild, frozen mountains. By the time dawn broke, bringing with it only a faint gray light, Samuel had already set his mind on a plan. He moved quickly, dressing in layers of warm wool and fur, before strapping his hunting knife to his side. The storm was not letting up, but he could no longer afford to wait. The cold in his cabin was too dangerous, and he knew he couldn't survive another night without making some changes. Outside, the snow had already piled up several feet high, making it impossible to even see the edge of the cabin. Samuel had spent enough winters in these mountains to know how snow could both protect and betray a man. As he made his way around the cabin, he observed how the snow had settled in an even layer, a natural blanket over the landscape. It was then that he saw at the beginnings of what he would come to think of as his snow tunnel. The ground around his cabin had been piled up so high that it created a natural trench. Samuel knelt down, testing the snow with his hands. It was solid, packed tight, and held the promise of insulation. He traced a path along the side of the cabin, wondering if he could dig into the snow to create an air pocket, a hidden passage that would trap warmth beneath the surface. If he could channel the wind away from the walls, create a sort of insulating barrier, it might just work. He grabbed his shovel and began working, digging through the deep snow with careful precision. The work was grueling, but the idea consumed him. The snow, packed tight by the wind, had a density that he could use to his advantage. As the hours passed, he began to see his plan take shape, an underground passage of sorts, where the cold would be held at bay by layers of packed snow and earth. By nightfall, Samuel had created a narrow, winding tunnel. It wasn't much yet, but the concept was there. He would build on it, using it to create a barrier of warmth that would help keep his cabin from succumbing to the cold. His hands were raw and his body exhausted, but the fire in his chest kept him moving forward. He knew that if this worked, he might just have discovered something that could help not just himself, but other men who lived as he did on the edge of survival in the brutal heart of the wilderness. He paused, looking at the snow tunnel he had dug. It was an unassuming thing, just a stretch of packed snow, but in that moment, it represented a breakthrough. He had the beginnings of a system that could defy nature itself, perhaps even beat it, and for the first time that day, Samuel felt a flicker of hope rise in his chest. It might be cold out there, but here in this cabin, he had a fighting chance. By the time the storm subsided, Samuel had finished his work on the snow tunnel. It was a humble thing, just a trench carved into the snow leading away from the cabin, with a narrow opening near the base of the log walls. But Samuel had learned long ago that survival wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, practical solutions that could make all the difference. And in this case, the difference was life or death. He spent the rest of that day and into the evening reinforcing his tunnel. He packed the snow tightly, ensuring there were no gaps through which the wind could creep. Samuel had noticed how the cold wind, whipping around the cabin, found every weakness in the structure, seeping through even the smallest cracks. But this tunnel, this insulation could work. The snow would block the wind, and the earth beneath it would hold the heat from the fire inside the cabin. The layers of snow would create a barrier, a sort of insulating shell, keeping the cabin warm even when the temperature outside threatened to reach deadly extremes. That night, as the temperature dropped again, Samuel gathered kindling for the fire. He built it up carefully, knowing that the warmth of the flames would be the test of his work. For the first time in days, he felt a quiet optimism. The fire crackled, the warmth spreading slowly through the cabin, but the real test would come when the night reached its coldest. As he sat by the fire, he could hear the wind howling outside, but the walls of the cabin no longer seemed so vulnerable. The snow tunnel was holding. Samuel had crafted something simple but effective. It wasn't an invention of great complexity, but it was born of necessity, of a man who knew that in the wilderness, failure was never an option. The heat from the fire began to radiate more evenly, and Samuel could feel the warmth slowly spreading to every corner of the cabin. It wasn't perfect, there were still cold drafts, but it was enough to stave off the worst of the night's chill. As he lay down to sleep that night, with his woolen blanket wrapped tightly around him, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The world outside was unforgiving, but inside the cabin, he had found a way to fight back. The snow tunnel wasn't a miracle, it wasn't going to change the world, but it was a solution, a clever way to outsmart the elements. And sometimes, that was all a man needed to survive. By morning, the temperature had plummeted again, but inside the cabin, it was noticeably warmer. Samuel stirred in his bedroll, stretching his stiff muscles, then slowly got to his feet. The fire was still burning low in the hearth, providing just enough warmth to make the cabin bearable. He stepped over to the small window, peering outside. The world beyond was a white blur, nothing but an endless expanse of snow, the trees hunched beneath their heavy coats of ice and frost. It had been days since the storm had begun, and Samuel was starting to feel the full weight of isolation. The weather was brutal, and the idea of venturing outside seemed more dangerous than ever. The snow had buried the land around him, and even the path to his trapping grounds was now invisible beneath the snowdrifts. The deep silence that had fallen over the mountains was only broken by the occasional howl of the wind, but even that seemed muffled by the blanket of snow. Samuel moved toward the door, his boots crunching in the snow as he stepped outside. He felt the sting of the cold immediately, but something was different now. As he approached the opening to his snow tunnel, he realized that it wasn't just the cabin that felt warmer, there was a deeper, more pervasive warmth in the air. The wind, which had once screamed through the trees and rattled his cabin, was quieter now. The snow tunnel had worked better than he had hoped. The heavy snow covering the land wasn't just an obstacle, it was a natural insulator. The tunnel had trapped the warmth from the fire inside the cabin, creating a thermal buffer between the bitter outside and the fragile warmth of his shelter. It was as if the snow itself was a hidden ally, something Samuel had never fully appreciated until now. He crouched down by the entrance of the tunnel, running his gloved hand over the packed snow. The cold had slowed its bite somewhat, but it still found its way into the world outside. Samuel knew that without this tunnel, the fire inside his cabin would have struggled to maintain its warmth. His ingenuity, simple as it was, had allowed him to use the elements to his advantage. He didn't have the resources to build a modern cabin, no stone or iron to reinforce the structure. But what he did have was his understanding of the land, and that was enough. The tunnel wasn't perfect. It wasn't going to last forever, and it wouldn't be enough to keep the cabin warm in every storm, but it had proven itself in these first few days, and that was something. Samuel knew that survival wasn't about building the most elaborate contraption, it was about making do with what was at hand and adapting to whatever the wilderness threw your way. That night, when the cold once again gripped the land and the wind howled at his door, Samuel settled into bed with a sense of cautious optimism. He had learned something new, something that would change the way he thought about survival in this harsh environment. And for the first time in days, he felt confident that he could weather whatever the wilderness would bring. The snow, which had once seemed like an enemy, was now a partner in his struggle for warmth. And as long as he could keep the fire burning, Samuel knew he could hold his ground. The sun had barely risen the next morning, yet the mountains already felt like a deep freezer. The storm had not relented. The relentless wind and snow continued their assault on the land. But inside the cabin, Samuel was feeling a quiet pride. The snow tunnel, though modest, had proven to be an effective shield against the worst of the cold. He sat by the hearth, sipping on a tin mug of hot coffee, watching the flames dance in the fire. The warmth in the cabin was unlike anything he had felt during the previous nights. Still, Samuel knew that he couldn't rely solely on the tunnel to survive the winter. The snow would not always remain packed tight, and the fire would eventually burn down. He had to consider the other threats the wilderness posed, namely, the lack of food. While his supplies would hold out for some time, the game was getting scarcer, and the prospect of venturing out into the storm to hunt was as dangerous as it was necessary. The cold had forced him into isolation, and the longer he stayed holed up in the cabin, the more he realized that the true challenge wasn't just surviving the cold, it was surviving the psychological toll that it exacted on him. As the days went by, the suffocating isolation began to gnaw at Samuel's mind. The storm was unrelenting, and each new snowfall seemed to bury any hope of escape. He couldn't help but wonder if he was alone in this fight. It was one thing to deal with the harshness of the wilderness, but quite another to do so in complete silence, with no one to share the burden. No one to offer help, no one to talk to, not even the comforting sounds of animals in the woods. The mountains had always been a lonely place, but now, as the world outside was blanketed in white, it felt even more so. Samuel glanced over at the snow tunnel again, noticing the slight shift in the snow's compactness. The weather was changing, and the wind had picked up once more. The snow tunnel, while effective in trapping warmth for now, would not stand up to sustained winds or a deeper freeze. It was a temporary solution, and Samuel knew that if he was to survive this winter, he would need to improve upon it. The cold had shown no mercy before, and it wouldn't start now. With a heavy sigh, Samuel made the decision to head out into the storm. He had to hunt. He couldn't wait any longer. The cold, the isolation, and the constant fear of running out of provisions had driven him to the point where he could no longer just sit and hope the weather would break. It was time to face the elements head on. The snow was deep, the wind bitter, but Samuel's will was stronger. Clad in his warmest layers, Samuel pulled on his thick woolen gloves and heavy boots. His rifle, slung over his shoulder, felt reassuringly solid, and the hatchet at his belt was a reminder of the tools that would keep him alive. He didn't know what the storm would throw at him, but he knew he had to try. As he opened the door and stepped into the storm, the first blast of freezing wind hit him like a wall. The snow whipped into his face, blurring his vision. But Samuel pressed on, determined to make it through this test. The wilderness was unforgiving, and it would show no mercy. But Samuel wasn't about to let it defeat him, not without a fight. Hours had passed, and Samuel's body ached with exhaustion. The cold had seeped into his bones, but he had pushed through. The storm had not relented, and the wind continued to howl as if trying to tear the very trees from the earth. The world around him had turned into a brutal, endless sea of white. Visibility was nearly non-existent, but Samuel had learned long ago to trust his instincts in these mountains. He had tracked enough animals and navigated through enough blizzards to know that a man's survival depended not just on physical strength, but on the quiet strength of his will. Samuel had managed to bring down a small deer, barely enough to sustain him for a week, but it was something. He had butchered it in the snow, his hands numb from the cold, his fingers stiff with frostbite, but the work was necessary. The meat would keep him alive, and the rest would go to the animals of the wild. The only thing he could do now was make it back to the cabin before the cold sapped the last of his strength. The trek back to the cabin was slow, each step a battle against the wind and the snow. He had learned to keep his movements deliberate, to conserve energy when the storm was this fierce. The weight of the deer carcass on his back felt like a constant reminder of how fragile survival truly was. He knew that in these mountains, things could turn for the worse in an instant. One wrong step, one false move, and he could end up buried in the snow, lost to the wilderness forever. When Samuel finally spotted the faint outline of his cabin through the blizzard, a wave of relief washed over him. He was almost home, but the storm had left its mark. The snow had piled up around the cabin, and the path to the door was nearly impassable. Samuel cursed under his breath as he struggled to push through the deep snow, his body trembling with fatigue. But at last he reached the door, his gloved hand grasping the handle. He pushed it open with all his remaining strength, stumbling inside. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave. He immediately went to the fire, adding more wood and stoking the flames. As he sat down to remove his frozen boots and thaw his numb fingers, he realized just how close he had come to disaster. He had made it back, but only just. The deer, while a small victory, was not enough to guarantee survival. The storm was far from over, and the cold still had its grip on the land. But Samuel had learned something in the hours spent outside. The cold could break a man if he let it, but it could also sharpen him, make him more determined. He had faced the storm, and for now, he had won. He looked over at the snow tunnel, the makeshift solution that had kept him alive so far. It was still holding strong, but Samuel knew it wouldn't be enough for much longer. Survival in this wild, unforgiving place demanded more than just the will to fight. It required adaptation, and Samuel was ready to continue the struggle. Days passed, and Samuel's routine fell into a rhythm as he continued to battle the elements. Each morning, he would check the snow tunnel, ensuring it was still functioning as an insulating barrier against the cold. The deep snow outside continued to accumulate, but inside the cabin, Samuel found a small sense of comfort in knowing that his tunnel was still working. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. Despite his small victories, the strain of isolation wore heavily on him. He had always prided himself on his ability to endure, but even the toughest of men could only take so much. The endless snow, the howling winds, and the crushing silence of the wilderness had begun to wear at his resolve. Samuel found himself questioning his choices more often than he liked. Why had he chosen this life? What was he really trying to prove by surviving alone in this God-forsaken place? One afternoon, as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, Samuel heard something strange, an almost imperceptible sound. He leaned forward, straining his ears. It was faint, but unmistakable. A voice? No, it couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him. After all, who else would be out here, braving the storm in this desolate wilderness? Samuel stood up slowly, grabbing his rifle instinctively, just in case. He moved cautiously toward the door, the snow creaking underfoot. The wind outside was still fierce, howling through the trees, but there was something different now, something faintly hopeful in the air. Samuel hesitated, unsure whether his mind was betraying him, but then he heard it again, a distinct knock, soft but deliberate, a knock on his cabin door. His heart raced in his chest. Could it really be? Another soul out here surviving the same conditions? Or was it a trick of the wind? He didn't know, but the idea of seeing another person, of having some form of contact with the outside world, seemed like a distant dream. Without thinking, Samuel flung the door open. The gust of wind nearly knocked him back, but there, standing in the snowdrift, was a figure, a man, gaunt and exhausted, his face obscured by a thick layer of frost and snow. The man's clothes were ragged, his hands raw from the cold. I was lost," the stranger rasped, his voice hoarse. "Been wandering for days. Thought I saw a light." Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man by the arm, pulling him inside the warmth of the cabin. He didn't know this man's story, but in this wilderness, survival often meant helping others who were just as desperate. The stranger collapsed near the fire, shivering uncontrollably. Samuel quickly added more wood to the hearth, and after a few minutes, the man seemed to regain some strength. He looked up at Samuel, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "I didn't think I'd make it." Samuel nodded, his own thoughts swirling. Here in the heart of this wilderness, amidst the raging storm and the ever-present threat of cold, he had found a connection, a reminder that no man was truly alone. The fire crackled, the warmth filling the small cabin as Samuel watched the stranger slowly thaw out before him. For the first time in days, Samuel allowed himself to feel something other than survival. He felt a flicker of hope, a fleeting thought that perhaps there was more to life than simply enduring the cold. The following days were a blur of activity as Samuel helped the stranger recover. He introduced the man to the snow tunnel, explaining how it had kept the cabin warm during the worst of the storm. The man, whose name was Jacob, listened intently, his eyes wide with admiration as Samuel described the simple but effective construction. Together, they worked to improve the snow tunnel, adding layers of snow and reinforcing it with nearby branches. The cabin was small, but with two people, it felt less oppressive. Samuel found himself enjoying the work again, his mind occupied not with the oppressive silence but with the task at hand. There was something about the presence of another person, the shared effort of survival, that made the work feel lighter. Jacob, it turned out, was a trapper who had been separated from his group during the storm. He had wandered for days, lost in the blizzard, unable to find his way back to his camp. His stories of near misses with wolves and the bitter cold resonated with Samuel. The wilderness had a way of stripping men down to their most basic instincts, and Jacob had learned that the hard way. The two men shared stories of their pasts. Jacob spoke of his life before the mountains, of family and friends he had left behind in search of adventure. Samuel, in turn, talked about his own past, of the years he had spent trying to carve out a life in these unforgiving mountains. Despite the difference in their histories, they both understood the same thing. The wilderness demanded everything, and the price of survival was often steep. As the days passed, the storm outside began to subside, though the cold remained. The work they had done on the snow tunnel seemed to be holding up, and the fire inside the cabin was always kept roaring. Together, they hunted and foraged, their spirits lifting with each successful venture outside. The isolation that had once threatened to break Samuel's resolve now seemed like a distant memory. Having Jacob around brought a sense of shared purpose that Samuel had longed for. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living. The cold still came each night, still threatened to freeze them in their tracks, but it wasn't the same. The knowledge that they had each other, that they could depend on one another, brought a new strength. In the warmth of the cabin, as the storm outside subsided into a soft snowfall, Samuel realized something profound. Survival in the wilderness was not just about the physical tools one had. It was about the strength of human connection. Alone, the mountain could break a man, but together, even in the harshest of storms, they had found a way to endure. The storm had finally passed, leaving the landscape covered in a serene, pristine blanket of snow. The world outside was silent, the trees heavy with the weight of the recent snowfall, their branches bowed low as if the earth itself was resting. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled with a steady warmth, the once fierce winds now only a whisper against the walls. Samuel sat by the hearth, his gaze distant as he stared into the flames. Jacob had already ventured out, surveying the surroundings, checking the traps they'd set together the day before. The work had become more manageable with two men now working in tandem. They had split the tasks hunting, gathering firewood, reinforcing the snow tunnel, and even though the cold had not abated, the weight of it felt lighter. They were no longer fighting the wilderness alone. For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt a sense of normalcy. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he first came to the mountains, but in some ways, it was more. In the past, survival had been a solitary battle. Now it was a shared experience. The thought of not having to face another night alone was something Samuel had not dared to hope for. Jacob had brought with him a kind of comfort, an understanding of the hardships that only someone who had lived through the same could offer. The days had grown longer, the sun's light lingering just a little more each day, hinting at the promise of spring. But Samuel knew better than to trust the mountains too soon. Winter was never fully defeated until the snow melted, and even then, the cold lingered in the air, always threatening to return with a vengeance. He heard the crunch of boots on snow, and Jacob entered the cabin with a satisfied grin. "Caught a few hares," he said, laying the small traps down beside the fire. The warmth of the cabin enveloped him, and Samuel couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, despite the endless battles with the cold and the snow, there was a new kind of peace settling into his bones. They had made it through the worst. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to feel gratitude. Not just for the survival of another day, but for the connection he had found with Jacob, and for the reminder that in the harshest places, humanity could still endure. The days passed more quickly now, the storm's grip on the mountains easing with every sunrise. Spring was still a distant hope, but Samuel and Jacob had become accustomed to the rhythm of survival. Together, they gathered what they could from the land, hunting, trapping, and preparing for the days when the snow would melt and the rivers would swell. The snow tunnel had held up longer than Samuel had dared to imagine, a testament to the ingenuity born of necessity. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, had transformed into a refuge. It no longer felt like a place to merely survive, it felt like a place to live. The warmth of the hearth was no longer just about keeping the cold at bay. It was a beacon of life, of the quiet but steady triumph of two men who had found a way to endure the unrelenting wilderness. One afternoon, as the wind picked up once more, signaling the possibility of another storm, Samuel and Jacob sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains met the sky. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since Samuel had arrived in these mountains, the uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. There was comfort in the unknown now, a sense that, together, they could face whatever came next. "Do you think we'll make it?" Jacob asked, his voice steady, but there was a question lingering in his eyes. Samuel looked over at him, the firelight reflecting in his weathered face. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew the wilderness was never truly conquered, but he also knew that the strength to survive was no longer found only in the land or in the tools he carried. It was found in the connections forged between two men who, despite the bitter cold and the endless challenges, had found a way to face the world together. "We will," Samuel said, his voice firm. "We've already made it." The fire crackled louder in the hearth, a testament to their perseverance. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the warmth of the cabin, both physical and emotional, held strong. And for Samuel, that was enough. The storm had passed, but the strength they had built together would carry them forward, no matter what the wilderness brought next.